a very famous Argentinian comic strip, and Clemente doesn't have any hands. And the idea was that because Clemente didn't have any hands, he couldn't steal. So therefore, Clemente made a more credible politician than any of the ones on offer from any of the political parties. So this was the context, and so people turned to each other. They said, we can't trust our political leadership. They're all thieves. They're all involved in this crony capitalist model. We need to turn to each other. So we wanted to know what the alternatives would be when people turned to each other, and we ended up making this film about occupied factories, about places where people had been fired from their jobs, and rather than allowing themselves to be fired, they went back to work. It was the opposite of a strike. If you think about a strike, withholding your labor, this was people unfired themselves, and it's quite interesting because if you think about the tactic, the traditional tactic of a strike, it's not a very effective tactic if people don't want you to work, right? So the idea was the machines still work, the equipment's still there, we have the skills, we've done this work, we can do it on our own. So this was a really powerful moment, not just in Argentina, but in the whole region. In Bolivia, they had just thrown out Bechtel because Bechtel had privatized the water system and hiked rates up 300%. Made it illegal to collect rainwater, unfair competition. And really, in Bolivia, it was at the early stages of what ended up becoming really a national revolution that ended up bringing Evo Morales to power. They were in the early stages of that. Brazil, they had just elected Lula. In Venezuela, they had just repelled a US-backed coup d'etat against Chavez. So things were really happening in Latin America in this period. But across the region, it was a revolt against what Latin Americans call el modelo, which is the model. And everyone knows what the model is. It's privatization, deregulation, cuts to government spending. It is this package of policies that we've all been living with. And it was just crashing in Latin America. It was no longer possible to impose these policies peacefully through free trade agreements, through the World Trade Organization, through the International Monetary Fund. It just wasn't working anymore. People were rejecting it on the streets and at the ballot box. So the idea for this book came from being in Latin America at this moment when the war in Iraq began. So here we were, and this ideology is crashing on the continent where it all began. And this is one of the things that I do in the book, is talk about how Latin America was the very first laboratory for these policies in the 70s, under the guidance of the so-called Chicago boys, the US-trained Friedmanite economists who worked hand in fist with the military juntas to impose these policies. So neoliberalism, as it's called in Latin America, was in crisis. And then in another part of the world, actually in the only part of the world where this economic model has not swept the Arab world, the Arab and Muslim world. It swept Latin America, Africa, North America, Europe. I mean, it's basically North Korea and the Arab world that remained protected. Even US allies like Saudi Arabia. 90% of Saudi Arabia's economy is in state hands. These are not countries that have accepted the neoliberal consensus, as it used to be called. So in another part of the world, this ideology that was crashing in Latin America is suddenly being imposed through tremendous violence. And this is what in the book I talk about 3 distinct forms of shock. And those 3 distinct forms of shock you could see very clearly in Iraq in this moment. The first was the shock and awe attack on that country, a military strategy that was designed explicitly to heighten the disorientation in the general population. What made shock and awe different from the doctrine used during the first Gulf War was that it targets the society writ large. That's a quote from the shock and awe manual. Now, immediately after shock and awe, in rides in Paul Bremer in his Brooks Brothers suits and army boots, the uniform of the disaster capitalist. And And he declares Iraq open for business. And Bechtel's there, right? Which had a particular resonance in Latin America in that period, Bechtel being there to rebuild the country's water and sewage system. And then Paul Bremer passes a series of laws that are exactly the same laws that had sent Latin America into crisis. Wide open to foreign investment, 100% foreign ownership of Iraqi assets, privatization. Then he assaults the public sector, right? They called it de-Baathification, but it was mass firing of public sector employees. So it seemed to me that the tactics of imposing this economic model had changed. The violence required to impose this economic model was increasing. Now, of course, the irony is that before 9/11, the desire to impose neoliberalism everywhere in the world was explicit, right? I mean, we were having an open debate about these policies. That's what the protests in Seattle were about. That's what the protests outside the IMF and the World Bank were about. But now we were hearing this mixed message from the Bush administration. Economics doesn't matter anymore. Security trumps trade, right? But at the same time, the exact same policies, accompanied by the exact same corporations, were storming into Iraq. And it was economic shock therapy through shock and awe warfare. Now, at the time, I thought that I was seeing something that was unique to the war, unique to the Iraq context. But after the tsunami, the Asian tsunami, I got an email. I'm on a listserv, the Via Campesina listserv, which is a network of small farmers around the world. And there was an urgent email that was sent out by the head of the Small Fishing Peoples Association in Sri Lanka just a few months after the tsunami hit, I think just 2 months. And the subject line was "The Second Tsunami of Corporate Globalization and Militarism." And this email described how in Sri Lanka, which had been one of the hardest hit countries by the tsunami, 40,000 people had been killed, almost 500,000 people had been internally displaced. Overwhelmingly, more than 90% of them were small boat fishing people who lived on the beach and made their living from the sea. They had been moved into inland camps, and while they were being warehoused in these inland camps, their land was being given away to resort developers, to industrial fishing fleets, and so on. At the same time, and I went to Sri Lanka and investigated this, 4 days after the tsunami hit, the Sri Lankan parliament advanced a water privatization law. 4 days. I mean, the country is still underwater, parts of it, from the tsunami. The dead aren't yet buried. And here they are pushing the most controversial piece of this economic program, water privatization. And it was more than that. It was electricity privatization. It was labor market flexibility, and all of it. It was after that I used the phrase disaster capitalism to describe what I was seeing in an article for The Nation. When the levees broke in New Orleans, what started to happen is that people started to use that phrase almost instantly to describe what was happening to them in real time, when you immediately had this response from lobbyists and Congress people saying, great, we get the housing projects now. We can turn them into condominiums. And we have a document on the website. It's one of the most damning disaster capitalist documents out there, which is the minutes from a meeting that took place at the Heritage Foundation 2 weeks after the levees broke in New Orleans. The subject, that heading, is 32 free market solutions for Hurricane Katrina.